Kia ora, good morning, welcome everybody. I think there's going to be more people joining, but I'll just let them in as they come, so we'll get going. Welcome to the Getting Started on Your Climate Action Journey session, where we're going to go through what's in the Mindful Fashion Climate Action Toolkit and talk a little bit about the pilot program that we ran last year. For those of you that are unfamiliar, Mindful Fashion is a non-profit industry organisation working to build a full circle and thriving future for the fashion and textiles industry here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Our work spans education, advocacy and collective action, all with a focus on advancing sustainable development of an industry where business, people and nature all thrive. We have actually about 99 members now who share that commitment and come from across the value chain in New Zealand, but also across the country, ranging from designers and brands and retailers through to textile suppliers, manufacturers and service providers. So I'd like to welcome everyone today to this session, Getting Started on Your Climate Action Journey. We're going to unpack today what's in our Climate Action Toolkit for fashion and textile businesses, which is a toolkit that we've developed for our members, so it's only available for members. And we're going to look at how businesses can use this toolkit in their sort of day-to-day working life. We're going to share a little bit about how it was developed out of the Climate Action program that we ran last year, the learnings that we had from that program that helped inform the development of the toolkit. And we're also going to hear from one of the program participants, Briar Llyod from Ruby, who's here with us. Welcome, Briar, who's going to share some of Ruby's learnings from measuring their carbon footprint and taking part in the pilot program. And hopefully share some systems that she's found useful or potentially started to implement and how they've integrated this work in their systems going forward. And hopefully at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. So that's the session. Just before I get going, I just wanted to touch on the housekeeping. So we're going to use the chat function for Q&A. If you have any questions that come up as we go through, please just pop them in the chat, because that way we can get back to you either during the session or at the end of the session in the follow-up email. We're also recording today's session, so it will be available for everybody to watch after the session for those that haven't been able to make it. So this is a quick overview, as I've just run through, of what we're going to talk about today. We know that the changing climate is the most significant threat that's facing the planet today. It's probably potentially the most significant threat facing businesses because of its impact on supply chains, on ability to operate. And we know that scientists agree this is attributed to the increase of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which makes addressing greenhouse gas emissions a really important sustainability challenge for businesses. And it's also an area that even small businesses can do something about. We know from our own research at Mindful Fashion, but also when we look around what's been happening throughout the world and throughout New Zealand, that one of the main reasons that small businesses delay taking action on their carbon emissions includes concerns about the skills that they may not have, the high cost involved in utilising a consultancy potentially, and the lack of time. And there's also a common misconception that SMEs are too small to make a significant impact, or that emissions reductions really only apply to those big, large corporations, the big polluters. But SMEs actually make up 90% of businesses worldwide and affect the livelihood of 2 billion people. Combined CO2 from SMEs is estimated to contribute 60 to 70% of industrial pollution. So it's huge. And SMEs have a really important role to play to address this global challenge for this very reason. We also know within Mindful Fashion, we ran a survey in 2021, and over 90% of our members, this was taking climate action and having support in that journey was actually the top priority that our members had in 2021, which is why we developed this climate action program. So what was the program all about? We created the Climate Action Pilot Program to address the barriers that I've just touched on of time, cost and knowledge that many SMEs face in taking and understanding their emissions and then working out how to actually start to reduce them. So we designed the program in partnership with ECOS, who are a carbon management and regenerative carbon project specialist organisation, who helped with the delivery of the program. And the program consisted of 3 elements, which you can see up on the slide. So firstly, a series of supporting resources and workshops. So we have a guide document and a series of workshops that we ran for the participants. Secondly, a spreadsheet tool and regular check-ins during the process of actually businesses collecting the data to measure their footprints and calculate their overall greenhouse gas inventory, which is basically an inventory of greenhouse gas emissions for a business. And the third part was the reduction strategies workshop that we held and supporting resources that businesses could then start to use to implement these strategies within their businesses. So our pilot program had these 3 sort of key aspects to it. And we took 10 businesses through this process over the course of about 6 months last year. We've taken our learnings from that program. We've sought feedback from all the participants, and we've refined the tools and the guidance that we used for that program, and that's what's led to the development of this Climate Action Toolkit. So it's sort of a sort of Mark II version of the guidance documents and resources. We learned a lot during this program as well. So not only did the businesses learn a lot by getting upskilled, but actually we learned a lot about what are the key drivers for climate action. We know from feedback that it's really important to staff within businesses. It's really important to customers. We've seen through the pilot program that businesses, people within businesses that get an understanding of their emissions profile, and what I mean by that is like, where are the emissions getting generated in your business? Once you see that on a graph, it's a light bulb moment. And so businesses, as soon as they started to see this information, were like, oh my God, I know what we need to do now to put something in place. So it really, getting that understanding was really key in starting to drive further action and knowledge sharing within businesses. We also learned that businesses are doing a lot, regardless of whether they're measuring their footprint, and taking action in areas such as waste reduction, in areas such as climate neutral freight where it's available. So there's a lot of things that businesses are already doing, and it's not a prerequisite to take climate action. It's not a prerequisite to measure your footprint. Like, you can start to reduce regardless of whether you know what your footprint is, but it's a really good way of getting an understanding of what it looks like to take the measurement. And we also had some businesses that participated that actually used the data as a form of an audit of their operational practices. They used it to identify environmental hotspots in their business for further attention. So there was a lot of really incredible learnings that came out of the process. We also saw that quick wins were identified during the data collection and measurement process that were acted on really quickly, which was really exciting as well. And I think Briar will be able to speak a little bit more to that in her part. And then also that longer term strategies were also identified, and there's a really good tool that ECOS was able to provide to sort of help cost out the long-term benefits, cost-benefit analysis of implementing different longer-term strategies in terms of emissions reductions. So the other really interesting learning that we got was we benchmarked the businesses that took part. Sorry about that. We benchmarked the businesses that took part in the pilot program and aggregated their emissions to understand, in general, on average, where are the emissions getting generated in the New Zealand clothing and textile industry. So the businesses that took part in the program were a range of different types of businesses. There were retailers, there were brands, there were textile suppliers. So they all undertake quite different activities. But what we can see from the graph here, the 2 different graphs, which I'll talk through in a second, is that there was a lot of commonality. It was very clear very easily where the biggest impact areas were for most of the businesses. So in figure 1, we've broken down the emissions by activity for all of the participants. So each activity, as you can see there, the biggest by far is freight. So that's freight. It's called upstream freight. So it's all freight that the business controls or operates. So that can include freight to customers if the business is controlling that. And so for some of the participants, it does include their customer freight. as well as their inwards goods freight. Electricity, company vehicles, they were generally the three highest emissions activities, and that was pretty much across the board, which was really interesting. And then the second figure is showing you the emissions by scope. So the guidance document goes into the scopes, what scopes mean in more detail, but emissions are generally broken down by direct emissions and indirect emissions. And scope 1 emissions are direct emissions that the company generates in fuel consumption. So that's in stationary fuel consumption, if you use LPG bottles, or if you use any sort of diesel generators or things like that, or mobile fuel consumption for company cars. So that's company owned cars. So that's generally what scope 1 covers. Scope 2 covers company electricity. So that's an indirect emission, but it's sort of directly linked to your business operations. And then scope 3 covers all other indirect emissions that your company causes either upstream or downstream in its supply chain as a result of its doing as business as usual operations. And that can be anything from freight and waste and business travel, all the way through to sort of leased assets, end of life of sold products. There's a whole range of different upstream and downstream scope 3 emissions. For our pilot program and also for our guidance documents, we have restricted our scope 3 emissions to organisational emissions, and this is defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is something that we have based our program on and our guide on, and they are defined as all of those emissions generating activity that are easier, should I say, for companies to access the data for, because you are able to directly link into your suppliers in a lot of those areas. So hence why it's restricted to things like business waste, freight and business travel. Those are things the company directly organises and arranges and is able to actually gather data for quite simply. So the organisational footprint of a business is what our toolkit covers. It doesn't cover right up the supply chain what your fibre supplier might be generating or what your garment manufacturer might be generating. There is scope for you to include that down the track if you want, but at the moment this toolkit only covers the sort of organisational footprint. So let's check out the toolkit and what's included in there. There's basically 4 parts to the toolkit. There's the guides, there's 3 parts to the guides. There's an introduction part to the guide called Understand, which goes through what are carbon emissions, what are all the different scopes and categories that I've just talked about. How do you understand those? What does it all mean? So that's the introduction part, and that's actually available for everybody on our website. The second part is understanding how to measure. What activity data do you need? Where do you find it? How do you gather it? What do you do with it once you've got it? How do you manipulate it into a form that is usable? And then how do you use that to actually calculate your emissions? So number 2 covers all of that, actually getting to the final number for your business. And then part 3 covers all the reduction strategies. So this is a new addition that the participants in our climate action program didn't have. This was developed after that, based off the workshop that we ran and further information that we were able to gather from ECOS and as well as other supporting organisations. But that's got a really useful range of reduction strategies across all of the key emissions activity areas that I've just talked about. So that's a really useful resource. So those are the guides. The second part is the data collection spreadsheet, which I'll show you a little bit more of in a moment. That is where you input all of your data. That's where you start to capture your data. It's just basically a receptacle for information for you to gather data and add it all up. The third part is a checklist. That's really just to help you understand where you are in the process and to tick things off as you go to keep track. And then the fourth part is a roadmap, which is really to, I'll go into this in a bit more detail too, but it really takes you through the process of what do I do this year? What should I be looking at next year? And then how does that roll out over time? So those are the 4 parts to our toolkit. here is just the guides, as I've just talked about. And so now what I will go through is, what are we measuring? So I touched on this just a little bit earlier. This is really the full value chain for an apparel and footwear company. So you can see going all the way through from raw materials on the left, all the way through the manufacturing process to retail and headquarters in the middle, and up to product repurposed, which is basically end of life or end of first life of a garment or a textile product. That's really the full value chain. And what we're measuring with this program and with this toolkit is the retail and headquarters and office, so the part in the middle, so direct emissions, scope 1 and 2, which is all the company's direct emissions, and then the other, so the light green circles are what we're measuring, so the others are the freight and distribution, both leaving the company and going out to customers and coming into the company. And then there's a couple of other sort of hotspots that have been circled there. That would be business travel and waste, more than likely, which are the other two quite main ones that we've measured. So you can sort of see that we know there are big emissions generating activities happening elsewhere. We know those are really, really difficult to get data on. So we've started with what we can measure, and it's been designed that way to get businesses going, to make it really much more straightforward to get going. So that's what we're measuring. And just this is all included in the guide, but this breaks it down a little bit further for you. So the column on the right, it shows you how things line up with the globally recognized standards. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the ISO 14064 standards are the two main global standards that everybody in the world uses to do carbon reporting, and our program and toolkit align directly with those. And this is sort of showing you where what we're measuring sits within that. So we're looking at stationary fuel, so any LPG, any mobile fuel used in your company cars, so diesel or petrol, any purchased electricity, steam or heat, mostly that for businesses, that's going to be your electricity that you purchase, inwards and outwards freight that you control, any business travel, including rental cars, taxis and Ubers, and private use of private vehicles, disposal of waste to landfill, and transmission and distribution losses, which are automatically calculated, so you don't need to worry about that, but they're included. So that's what we're measuring in the toolkit. That's what we're sort of getting a guide on. And so the guidance documents take you through how to go about this process. And the main tool that you're going to use is the spreadsheet, which is called the data collection spreadsheet or data collection tool. This is the front page of it, which basically tells you what to do. It sort of covers all the main areas of information that you might need, and it takes you through the process of how to go about it. So you use this tool in conjunction with the guide, and you work through the process, basically filling out your company information. So there's different tabs down the bottom. So you start with company information to fill out that once you've chosen the year that you're going to be reporting on. So most businesses will start with a baseline year that is tied into their financial year for ease of reporting, and potentially one that's, the most recent one is probably the most practical one to use. And then you outline under company information, you put this information in, and reporting boundary is selecting those categories that are applicable to your business. So I showed you earlier, the categories are things like electricity, freight, waste, fuel combustion. So basically just selecting which ones of those by ticking a box that you're going to use. So you've got this master record of what it is that you're measuring for what year. And then each of the tabs gives you a place to input the information. So this is showing you the reporting boundary, as I just talked about. So basically this is a drop down menu in the orange here. So you click yes or no if you want to include it. There's a column here called mandatory for certification. So we partnered with ECOS on developing this program. So businesses that that wanted to could go through the ECOS certification program at the end of the process if they wanted to purchase carbon offsets and then certify as being one of the ECOS certification standards, whether that be carbon neutral or carbon reduction. I think they have a number of different ones. So the reason that column is there is that you need to report on that if you want to certify through ECOS. So that's just to explain that. This is showing you an example of what the transport fuel tab looks like. Basically, excuse me. Basically, you have a reporting year, say for example, the 1st of April 2022 to the 31st of March 2023. That might be the reporting year that you're going to report on for your footprint. For that year, you need to gather all of the fuel consumption for your company, in litres preferably, for all the diesel or the petrol that you purchase. You don't need to break that down by month. You can if it's easier. It's really what you need what you need at the end of the day is for the dark blue boxes to be full. So you need the actual total for that year for how much you used. So different companies have different processes of recording this information. Briar might be able to speak a bit more about what they do at Ruby. I know some companies find it really useful to record this by month so that they can track back over each month and understand, once they've implemented changes, are those changes, those reduction changes going through, and how are they able to sort of measure that on a more granular level rather than just waiting for a full year to go past. So there's benefits to breaking it down by month, but that is entirely at the at your discretion in terms of how you use this. So each tab has a very similar layout. It's asking you for the totals. It gives you the opportunity to put that out in a format, but you are able to manipulate that to whatever works for your business. And so this is the final summary tab at the end. So with once you've collected all of the data to measure your footprint, and you've got your totals in all of those dark blue boxes that I showed you here, so petrol litres total, diesel litres total. Once you've got those totals, the next step is to enter this information into a calculator or like an emissions calculator or an emissions tool. And for our pilot program, we used the ECOS Business Lite tool. In the guide, I covered 2 examples of different tools. So I cover the ECOS Business Lite tool as well as the Climate Action Toolbox tool. So those are both 2 different tools. Neither of those tools are 100% what we want for our industry, but at the moment they are the best available. And so the reason that we've now got a summary tab on the spreadsheet is to help our businesses get a more granular level of information so that they can start to analyze their footprints. And something that we hope to do over time is actually develop something really specific for the industry here, but it's quite a complicated process. So that you enter these totals in the ECOS Business Lite tool, and it gives you a summary printout of what your emissions totals are for your different categories. And what I've suggested here is that you take those totals and you enter them into the light blue boxes here so that you can start to see where, so you can start to see where the emissions are getting generated the most. So what will happen is that the graphs will start populating as you enter information into these boxes. There's also another summary tab on here, which I haven't got a screenshot of, called Summary 2, and that gives you the ability to break down your freight by mode of transport. So we saw earlier that the freight emissions at 70% are like the biggest emissions generating activities. So what we were getting from the ECOS Lite tool is an overall freight emissions number. And in order to be able to make better use of that data, we needed to be able to break that down into actual different modes of transport. So what's getting generated from air freight, what's getting generated from sea freight, what's getting generated from road freight. So there's another tab on the spreadsheet called Summary 2, where you can enter your different amounts into the into the boxes, and it will break down your freight over different categories for you, so that you can then see across the range of activities, where are those emissions getting generated. So that's basically what the tool will do. So once you've done that whole process, you've entered your information into the ECOS Business Light calculator or the other tool, you've basically calculated your emissions for the reporting period, so for that year. So you've finished the process of measuring your carbon footprint or developing your greenhouse gas inventory for that baseline year. This is an example of a business. It's not one of the businesses that took part in our program. It's another one that I found online. So this is an example of a business who, the business's carbon footprint that measures very similar emissions activities, but they've also included working from home here. I think that was done during a COVID year. And so this is showing, and in fact, this will be done during a COVID year, because we can see that domestic flights are quite low. So something I didn't touch on a bit earlier was that the participants in our program, everybody was measuring a period that was happening around 2020, 2021, 2022, which was, we know there was a lot of travel restrictions with COVID-19 in New Zealand. So most of the businesses had zero in their business travel category for activities, which in an average year would not be the case. So we know that business travel is going to be really high for a lot of businesses, because there is a lot of travel that goes on with sales, with traveling overseas, etc. So this business, again, I wouldn't say that business travel would be up there at the same level as freight, nowhere near, but it generally would be much higher than the other categories, and would sort of be halfway in between, based on average from my experience. So this looks like it's probably a COVID year to me as well. But just showing you what an emissions profile looks like, so that you can get a snapshot of where is my emissions happening in my business. The third part of the toolkit, I guess the third part of the process, is looking at reduction strategies. And so we held a workshop with our pilot program participants with ECOS to go through how do we start to develop reduction strategies, and out of that came some really useful tips and tools which we've used to build this extra guide on developing reduction strategies. And I just wanted to talk you through a couple of those now, because I think they're really important to think about. So ECOS recommend that you list your top 5 emission sources. So if we look at this profile here, those top 5 emission sources would be freight transport, domestic flights, non-company vehicles, purchased energy and fuel. So list those top 5 emission sources, and then start to fill out this table. Once you've worked through the guide, which goes through all of the different reduction strategies, start to fill out this table with what are our short, medium and long-term priorities in this area, who's responsible for it, and how are we going to sort of monitor our performance. So as an overall sort of, I guess, plan of reduction for your business, this is quite a good tool to use. The other useful tool in the guide is the impact ease matrix. This could also be done with impact cost of implementation matrix. And so just really useful, we did this in our workshop, really useful to brainstorm with your teams, talk through with everybody involved. Say, if, for example, if you're looking at freight emissions, like what are some of the things we could do to really reduce our freight emissions, start to brainstorm ideas, put them on the matrix. What's really high impact? We're going to really achieve some reductions, but it's going to be really, really long term, going to be really difficult. Start to place these things on this matrix to help identify what are some of the short wins, or sorry, the quick wins that we could implement now that could have a high impact that we know are easy, versus what are the longer term, maybe more expensive ones. So this was a really useful tool that we've also included in the guide. And then within the guide, the reduction guide, there's really sort of three, I guess, a sort of three framework approach to looking at reduction strategies. So the first part is reducing your own direct emissions which are your scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is your fuel consumption that you are using in your company cars and your electricity. Those are things that you can generally take action on pretty quickly, easily, because you're directly controlling all of those activities. The second one is your scope 3 emissions, such as travel, waste and freight, which are, you know, slightly more difficult. They're going to take a little bit longer. They require you interacting and engaging with your suppliers, but there's still things that you can sort of directly take action on yourself in some ways. They may not be as easy or as quick, but they're definitely things that you have within your ability to start to look at. And then the third is, what are the bigger initiatives that might require capital investment? You know, that might be things like switching to an electric vehicle, or it might be things like, you know, collaborating on a sort of low emissions or zero emissions freight supplier or something like that. So what are those bigger long-term things that require capital investment that are going to take some time? So those are the sort of the three, that's sort of the framework of approaching reduction strategies, and it does go into more detail in the guide. And then there's also a range of changes that you can implement within your business. So policy changes and operational changes. So can you implement a company travel policy where people have a certain budget that they need to meet in terms of you can only travel X amount of miles per month? Or could you implement a policy internally around keeping the lights turned off or something like that? So policy and operational changes, behavior changes and infrastructure changes. So those are sort of directly related to the three pillars above, but each activity within the reduction guide, so for example, petrol consumption, each activity like that has a range of behavior changes that you could implement, policy changes that you could implement, and infrastructure changes that you could implement. So a lot of the work is there. It's a case of sitting down with your teams or the people that are responsible and decision makers and identifying what are the ones that are going to work for us, putting them on the matrix, understanding how they might fit into your long-term plan, and then starting to take action with them. So that's the three stages to the guide and the process of actually measuring your footprint and developing reduction strategies. The last two I'll just touch on briefly before we hand over to Briar, but the other two things that we've included in the toolkit is the climate action checklist. So this really is just something for you to print out or have on your computer and tick off as you go. You know, you're planning your inventory, collecting your data, calculating your data, analysing and reducing, setting targets and showing progress. So all of these 6 stages are talked about in the guides, but they're the sort of key stages that you will be working through as you do this process. And then the last part is the roadmap. So this is a very high level roadmap, but it's really just as a guide for businesses to sort of understand how this looks over the longer term. So in year 1, as we've just talked about, you're educating and upskilling, you're using the tools and resources, you're collecting the data, you're calculating your emissions, and you're understanding and analysing them over the first sort of 3 to 6 months. And I expect that first process will take you 6 months to sort of measure your footprint and gather that data. That was generally, I would say, the sort of expected time frame from our pilot program. That was reasonable for an SME who, you know, you're taking somebody from their normal day-to-day tasks and getting them to implement this whole new work stream. And then sort of for the following 6 to 12 months, starting to identify where we can make reductions, starting to engage with your internal teams and educating them, developing reduction strategies, establishing better systems, activating your reduction plan, and then over the next sort of 2 to 4 years, starting to once you're starting to get some of these reduction activities implemented and you're measuring your footprint year on year, you will start to be able to monitor your progress and understand what's been impactful and what's not. So you're really understanding and tracking progress against your goals. So this is sort of just a high level roadmap for you. Don't be put off by this at all. It's just really showing you, you know, where you're heading, which is, you know, this is the start of a bigger journey, but it's I think, yeah, the most challenging part is understanding it. Once you've kind of understood it. And hopefully Briar will touch on this as well. Once you get started and you kind of understand what you're doing, then it's, you know, much more straightforward once you get going. So that is the end of my part of the presentation. This is all available on our website. It's freely available for members. If you're not a member, let me know, sign up to become a member. And if you have any questions as you're working through any of this, please reach out. Really happy to help. And yeah, I would like to now invite, that's worked. I'd like to now invite Briar to share a little bit about Ruby's learnings during the program and anything that, you know, you've taken on moving forward, and anything, yeah, that you would like to share.
Cool, thanks, Jacinta. I also had some slides, if I could share those. I think you might need to enable.
I'll just let you do that. There we go.
Oh. Cool, can everyone see that? Thank you. Awesome. Thanks, Jacinta. So my name is Briar Llyod. I'm the Planning and Logistics Manager here at Ruby. I think majority of the people on this call will be incredibly familiar with Ruby, but wanted to do, I thought, an intro as well, just for those who are maybe catching up on a recording later on. So for those of you who may not know Ruby, we're an eminent fashion label from Aotearoa and a family-owned brand founded in 2002. What we really see is a mutually nourishing relationship with our community and with our designs embodying those who wear them. So we have two brands, Ruby and Liam, and we have 7 stores around New Zealand, as well as an online store. And our general manager, Emily Miller-Sharma, is a co-founder of Mindful Fashion. So I'll be talking to you today about our experience with carbon emissions reporting and taking part in the Mindful Fashion program, which we undertook late last year as part of the pilot program. So I'm going to cover a bit about our results and what we learned from them, what systems and processes we found helpful, as well as then how this has informed our plan of attack going forward and what this looks like. But sort of really wanted to get across as well, sort of as a key takeaway and something to kind of motivate people who might not have started this journey as well. I think often we can kind of see these types of projects that may be more like sustainability related, or whatever you want to call them, as a bit more of like a nice to have, or something that's a bit more of a side project. But actually work like this, and especially carbon reporting, can be like really informative and important as part of core business. And for us has really given us great clarity around where we need to focus our attention, both as a company as well as I think like a broader industry as well. So in terms of our journey, where are we coming from? So for us, this was our first time as a business formally measuring our emissions. So this has been a bit of a work in progress for us over the past couple of years. We'd looked at working with programs like Toi2, but naturally in the past few years around COVID times, this has been quite a challenge, like I know it has for a lot of other companies. So this program was really great for us to be able to get the ball rolling, as we really recognize you can't manage what you haven't measured. So we measured our emissions for the financial year 2021 to 22. So as you mentioned, Jacinta, for these different scope areas, all the things in our direct control and for all our locations and facilities in New Zealand. So this included for Ruby data relating to our daily operations in our IRL stores at our Ruby HQ, the freight of our materials as part of the production and development process, freight to get garments from our factories to Ruby HQ, and then freight to send our garments to our IRL stores, wholesalers, and customers as well. So yeah, and as you mentioned, obviously this was quite a COVID impacted time. So seeing that sort of, I think, is an outcome in some of the results, and also we also measured aspects, like you said, working from home as well, as that was also something a lot of our team were doing during this time. So in those technical language, it's scope 1, scope 2, and part of scope 3. So in terms of what we learned, so for Ruby during this period, that looked like a total carbon emissions of 359.496 tonnes of carbon. So in terms of measuring the intensity of that, we had an average of 51.2 full-time employees for that period. So that gave us an emissions intensity of 7.02 tonnes. So that figure and breakdown is really helpful for us to then track our progress as we've grown quite a lot as a business since that time period, and also as we change over the coming years. And this has also been helpful for us to be able to benchmark ourselves against others in the industry, and also from this total start to get a bit of an idea of what offsetting investment could look like as an option. So to note as well, like these results have not been formally audited yet. That's a work in progress we have right now with Toitu, but we feel really confident to share these results. We have these on our website because of this process we went through as part of the program. And then in terms of our largest areas of emissions, you'll see in that table at the bottom. So very consistent with the other companies that Jacinta mentioned, freight being the largest proportion, being 86% of our emissions. And then secondly, waste to landfill being 5.83% of our emissions. So seeing this breakdown has really helped us bring to light what our red flags are. So I'll run through those in a little bit more detail. So the first one being freight, and most in particular air freight. So a lot of you will know from different companies and on the call, like a big challenge in production and logistics is having product delivered at the right time. But actually seeing how air freight emissions and the impact of those has really sharpened our focus to nailing this down to more so being more an emergency. We often hear how this air freight's a big emitter of carbon, but seeing this breakdown was a real eye-opener. You can see in the table that whilst our air freight made up only 24% of our usage in terms of all freight, it made up 90% of our emissions. So obviously this period, as I've mentioned, was very, very heavily impacted by COVID. And we're still, seeing a lot of those, we saw a lot of that instability in supply chains, which has sort of dragged on over the past few years. So we definitely had to air freight a lot more in that period than we probably would normally to help us get product in on time. So yeah, while we've definitely seen some improvements, I think we can all agree there's still sort of this instability around sea freight, different types of freight for all of us. So we've worked really hard to refine our design and purchasing processes to mitigate these types of effects on our business. So in terms of what that looks like, we've set a target that we will sea freight 80% of our product going forward, and we plan to be there by October 2023. We've increased our design and production teams so that we can work further ahead of time. We've also reworked our purchasing methods so that we can still operate successfully when product is delayed. There'll always be seasonal product that needs to be here on time, especially around those peak summer and winter product periods. But we accept that air freight is something we still need to use now and again, but we sort of are trying to see it as more of a fallback rather than the standard. So moving on to waste. So having waste to landfill as the second highest contributor for us, it was definitely a genuine shock for us as a company. I think as most people from Ruby on the call will know, like we have really strong waste minimization practices in place at our company. However, this really was a good reminder of what the emissions impact of landfill is, and that we need to be even better with our operations. So for Ruby HQ and our IRL stores, taking further steps to get our team on board to reduce waste to landfill even further, and then also looking at what improvements we can also make as well. So that's keeping up practices like where our production measures mean that none of our cut and sew waste from New Zealand production goes to landfill. That's what that image is there of some of our offcuts that we keep from all our local production and use for different products and other purposes. And so then also continuing with practices like composting organic waste, sending broken plastic hangers back to our manufacturer to be recycled, recycling in-house and collecting soft plastics, utilising low-impact packaging options. And we have a bunch more information around this and waste on our website. We have a really great toolbox for change section there, which outlines a lot of this in more detail. But also something to note as well, as mentioned, in terms of the scopes that were measured. So we measured waste in terms of the areas that we have direct control over, so not our makers. So this doesn't include these waste results don't include that CMT waste, but if it did, like, which is the standard, and with the standard process for a lot of companies in the fashion industry, where that CMT waste is disposed of and does go to landfill, if we were doing that, our emissions would be so much higher. For companies, you can imagine, would be extremely high. So this was really a good reminder, I think, for us as well, why as an industry we really need to make sure we're working together on how we can channel those excess materials from the make process away from landfill and into other products that are more valuable as well. And then, so I'll run through as well in terms of, from a very much more like practical and ops perspective of doing this program, what worked. So as I mentioned, for us, this was the first time doing this program or doing the reporting. And I think very much so, like, the first time doing the measurement is definitely the hardest and most daunting. There's a lot of detailed information required. So doing with this with a group, like we did with the program, where we had to all meet deadlines, we had templates prepared, and we also shared and learned from each other, made this so much more achievable. So thanks so much again, Jacinta, for all your help on this. Like, it helped us really get the ball rolling and made such an impact. So from a very practical perspective of doing this program, I think some people will either like wince at the image of a spreadsheet or look at a bit more familiar love, maybe. But it was definitely found that doing this, taking more of a like traditional project management approach to this, was really helpful. So that meant kind of like taking time at the start to really map out all the different key data areas and different milestones really helped. And then not only just like get it done on time with that deadline, but also just to break it down into like smaller moving parts and make it feel more approachable. I think like no matter who you are, like it can be a little bit of information overload for anyone. So making it feel like, okay, smaller steps I can chip away at makes it feel a lot more doable. And then moving on from there, kind of connecting with different key people in the organization who you might think you need to get information from. So for us, that was mostly like working with our accounts team and then our ops team as well, from more of like a facilities perspective. And so that first part of the process was very much more sort of, kind of ops related, connecting with the facilities side of things, contacting our various suppliers and landlords, etc. And then the second half of the process was much more sort of intensive data processing and working through all the information that was gathered. So in terms of that data processing side of things, I definitely found some areas were more complex than others. Like for some of our stores, for example, the ones who were in maybe more like shopping centres or who had shared facilities, I mean, you sort of had to look at things in a different way. And the process also really raised for us as well, I think, which of our suppliers have good data available or who are easy to work with versus some who may be slightly more challenging. And then also how you are quite reliant on them as well, your suppliers, in terms of what work you might have to do in terms of data processing as well. So for example, like our freight forwarder, like Amazing, gave us like the exact data we needed in the exact units format, versus others like DHL and New Zealand Post was a bit more, required a lot more work in terms of processing. Jacinta made some very nifty distance formulaic calculators for all our online orders. So I think that's something I think maybe has slightly improved from their side going forward, but that just is an example. So I think therefore, especially that's an example of where like with mindful fashion, especially, we sort of, I think there's a great opportunity to build on some of those supplier relationships that all of us in the New Zealand industry use together. For example, I think most people will probably use New Zealand Post, and how we can sort of build on that and make this process easier with them for all of us taking part in this type of work. So yeah, in terms of anyone sort of looking to take on this program or type of work, it's definitely requires some of those skill sets like I've mentioned, and then like a massive importance around planning and organization. You're taking in a lot of data and information, so you really need to quite carefully manage that if you're going down the process of then going to be audited. And this is the type of project I would say I found it definitely helped actually having that slightly short, I think for us, it was about a 3-month period and working on that quite intensively versus trying to like chip away at it over a year. That was definitely very helpful. But going forward, I think Ruby, we're in a really cool position now. We were in the benefit of having done it for the first time. So we've got that out of the way. We have a lot of these templates, plans made up, like our freight map, contact lists, all of that set up. So now this is something that's much more easier to then go and repeat. And we have those processes in place to use going forward. And then being able to also share those with other or pass those on to other team members to take on this type of work, which we're currently doing. So going forward, so I've mentioned about those red flags and some of those specific improvements. From a broader perspective, our general manager, Em, I thought had an interesting take on this about how there's really clarity to be found in what we call the mid-row. So then we can actually hold what matters most kind of front and center, as opposed to getting really too lost in like the micro or like an unclear macro perspective. So for us, for this program has really given us that focus and informed our goals and priorities for this year going forward. So that looks like as a macro goal, reducing carbon emissions, but in that mid-row goal, we can say, which is now based on facts as well from doing this program, which is to reduce air freight at Ruby, as well as better dealing with our operational waste and contributing to structural change in the industry to reduce manufacturing waste to landfill. So in terms of our plan, so we will audit our past 2 financial years of emissions relating to all things that are in our direct control with Toitu in September this year. And sort of as well recognizing that those different areas could be quite different over those 2 years as we've moved out of COVID, seeing other areas go up again, like even our road usage, electricity, business travel and that sort of thing. And from there, we can then really see the changes in emissions that have occurred over the past few years and then make more of a robust plan to reduce them. And we've also been really trying to focus as well on some quick wins, like you mentioned, Jacinta. So for us, that's been switching energy suppliers to Ecotricity, who are carbon neutral with energy from 100% renewable sources. And we've also been in the process of upgrading our car fleets to be hybrid or electric. And we've converted already one of our vans, which we use every day, to electric as well. And then more long-term, we plan to investigate and measure more of those emissions related to the full supply chain, like you showed in that infographic, recognizing there's some of those high impact areas like around fabrics that are produced in mills overseas and that sort of thing. And then I think as well, expanding on benchmarking the results in the industry here in New Zealand. We started that this year or in the past year with the ones from the past program, but I think it'll be really beneficial once we have more companies participating in this program to have more of an idea of where we all sit as an industry, because a lot of this data is actually really hard to find, whether that's New Zealand specific or around the world. And then as well, continuing to work with Mindful Fashion as a collective on more industry solutions that would benefit all of us. So I'll wrap there. For anyone else watching this later and who would like to learn more about Ruby as well and our work, we have a really amazing toolbox section on our website, our new site. There's an abundance of information over there, so I hope you can check it out. There's the link at the bottom there to learn more. So yeah, open to any questions as well following this.
Thanks so much, Briar. That was awesome to see how, to learn more about how you, I guess, how you've used the learnings from the program. So what your emissions are, and then you've sort of broken it down. I really like how you took us through what you're doing about the sort of top 2 or 3 emissions areas and how you set some really clear goals around that. That was really helpful to understand. Has anyone got any questions that they would like to either just turn themselves on and ask or put in the chat? While people are thinking about that, I have a question. Have you sort of created any internal tools or systems that have you put any systems in place to make gathering the data easier for next time? So you know, in terms of capturing fuel consumption or in terms of gathering data on business travel? Like, is there any sort of things that you were like, oh, we should be doing it like this?
When we were doing it the past year, working with our accounts team worked really well, and that didn't seem to be too difficult. I think we'd already kind of had that set up to be sort of tracked in quite an efficient manner, but I think there is probably as well. So we hadn't acted on anything from doing it that time, but I think there's definitely opportunity from that, which I think we had talked about, like, or you might have mentioned Jacinta, around there might be integrations with like Xero and that type of thing to help pull that. But I think because we had sort of fuel cards and that sort of thing, we were able to pull that, and it was fairly straightforward.
Yeah.
But I think otherwise as well, as I said, creating some of those things like just the templates, organizational sort of templates from this process, like our freight map, our list of suppliers or landlords for all of our stores, having that set up, doing that for the first time and setting that up, that's made that all just so much more straightforward to do this process again in future years.
Yeah, that's such a great tip.
I think definitely the freight map as well, because I think, as I mentioned, those different freight combinations, there's so many different ones, like manufacturer to us, or us to our wholesalers. So actually just mapping out all those different combinations of freight, and then who are the different suppliers for each of those, like just having that all now collated in one area and a map has been really helpful, because sometimes you kind of know that's happening, but to actually lay that out has been really helpful.
Did you do that as a visual? Like, did you literally draw it on a big piece of paper, or how did you map that out?
Well, very natural to my planning team roots. It was just on a spreadsheet, but that's just normally how I roll. But I think there's also, you could definitely make it much more visually orientated as well.
Yeah. That's a really good tip about the freight map. So mapping out all the different freight routes so you can identify all the suppliers. And another sort of I guess hack that I've heard is that if you're not the person that's running the finance and accounts, build a really close relationship with them, because if you look through your suppliers by dollar spent, that will give you a really good indication of like who are your main suppliers that you're going to need to get data from. So that's another way to sort of start to understand, who it is that you need to engage with. Any questions?
I think a lot of people are very, very familiar with Ruby. So cool.
Well, that's good. We've got quite a few that want to see the recording, so it's been great. So thank you so much for that, Briar. Really, really cool. And thanks everyone for coming. And we'll sign off now. Give you an extra spare minute for lunch. And please do, get in touch if you need any help getting started, or have any further questions that you want to talk about with me one-on-one or with Briar. And otherwise, have a really great rest of your day and a good Matariki weekend coming up. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.